So, welcome back everyone. I'd like to introduce Alex Blom. He is from Toronto and he's a maintainer of ember-cordova and is going to talk about that.
Great. So hey everybody, as you just said, I'm Alex in case you missed that. So we're going to talk about ember-cordova a little bit in both frameworks independently, just so I can get a feel for the room, because this can go one of two ways. Who here has built an Ember app before or just kind of knows what Ember is? Disappointed in you all. Just to really get a feel of the room, who's shipped a PHP app in the last year? Okay, we've redeemed ourselves. And who here has built a Cordova application before? Okay, great. So I think I'm going to change up the content a little bit, and once we get to a demo, I'm going to slow down and just show you a little bit how Ember works and why it's a good idea to use inside of Hybrid. Then we're going to talk about performance techniques as well. Whether you're using Cordova or Ember or Angular or even just raw JavaScript, same techniques will apply. I'm just going to show you them inside of an Ember shell. So we're going to skip through all of that. In terms of why we like to build this way though, and you've probably seen this a bunch of times, but we like building in Ember because it's actually a very, very strict framework to work in. I often consider it the fastest to actually build in once you know it, but it absolutely has the steepest learning curve out of all of the front-end frameworks. And the main reason for that is that it really is a community driven by convention. So every Emberist will generally approach a problem the same way. We're not allowed to buck those trends. In fact, Ember will actively block you from doing that. And you'll see that coming as we go through code. But we also have things like our router is a first-class citizen, our CLI is a first-class citizen. And you see this kind of being adopted more and more through the JavaScript community. A really good example, it was kind of a funny self-troll, but it's a good thing to have happen, is the Angular CLI was originally a fork of the Ember CLI. And when it first came out, they forgot to substitute the word Ember for Angular. So when it would crash, it would say for help go to emberjs.com, which is honestly one of my favorite things. So Ember describes itself as a framework for ambitious applications. So one of the interesting things you'll find is that Ember's adoption in startups is less than what you may think, especially when compared to, say, a React or an Angular. When you start dealing with bigger companies or bigger needs, you find that Ember starts to really pick up in adoption. You see a lot of Ember use at IBM, you see a lot of it at Microsoft. Apple Music inside of iTunes is actually an Ember app. PlayStation Store is actually an Ember app. Xbox Store is actually an Ember app. So you do see it all over the place. So we like it because of that organized approach. And what's interesting is historically people have thought that Ember was a slower framework because it's so heavy and it does so many things. Glimmer 2 is Ember's new rendering engine, very much inspired by React, but it obviously has an Ember flavor and it's built to work in that. And as I actually wrote it in the slides, which is amazing, without getting to a shit-slinging contest, it's not so much that it's better or worse than React as much as we can match that rendering performance now. So we can actually go and hit past 60 frames per second, which is now an arbitrary limit that most people can't see or perceive the difference on. And where this really matters is in mobile, we need to worry about animations a lot and stuff like that. As I said, items like routing controls and components of first-class citizens will tour an app in the demo. So I added this slide actually just while the last speaker was going on, because I've had this conversation with a lot of people today asking, how we deal with development workflows and testing inside of an Ember ecosystem. So I want to give a shout out to this really good library called Ember CLI Mirage. And what Mirage lets you do is actually stub a development API that sits inside of your Ember application. So as AJAX requests are going to your store, which is what we call it in Ember, you can actually write fixtures that will just stub responses back, and you can ship that inside of any container. So what it means is instead of needing to have a development API when you're just mucking around and stubbing or trying to get started, inside of your Ember app, you just define fixtures and you can trust that those will be returned from your routes. The other really nice thing is if you define those fixtures properly, you end up recycling all of that work in your testing. So by virtue of having a good dev flow, you're basically setting yourself up to have testing done. So this is what this looks like. This is just basically a Mirage config file. We're saying, whenever somebody tries to request /authors by AJAX, I want you to return every single author stub that we've created. And to define those stubs, we just create a factory like this. If you've ever done Ruby, this probably looks very, very similar. Ember, in a lot of ways, came out of the Ruby community, which is why you'll see a lot of similarity there and a lot of love for convention over configuration. So in terms of hybrid as well, I just always have to make this point because one of the saddest things we see is people who go and write an Angular application or an Ember application, drop it inside of a Cordova shell, and then complain that it doesn't perform as they want, complain that there are delays or it's janky. Basically, if you write bad code, it's not going to work no matter what you do. And I think a lot of times people just write really shitty desktop code and they just don't realize because the desktop is powerful enough to make up for a lot of their mistakes. When you're working in hybrid, it really does force you to do things the right way. Again, we're going to cover that, but especially in Cordova, the ecosystem is legitimately littered with leaky code that you shouldn't be using. And as we get into it, I'll kind of show you how you should learn what to avoid. So I wanted to cover this as well because there's a lot of confusion with new devs in terms of the difference between Cordova and PhoneGap. So Cordova was originally PhoneGap. It was actually, I think the first commit was in 2008, and it was called PhoneGap the whole time. That was the open source project and the equivalent to what I use today. And in 2011, Adobe purchased Nitobi, who were the creators of PhoneGap. And after a little bit of a kerfuffle, the open source version was then called Cordova and donated to the Apache Foundation, and that now fits under Apache Foundation rules. And PhoneGap now describes an Adobe's productized version on top of Cordova. Probably don't ever use PhoneGap anymore, just use Cordova. You don't really need any of that stuff on top. And just because I thought it was fun, this is actually what the first ever PhoneGap website looked like. So we've come a long way. So for those who don't know, what Cordova basically does is it creates an iOS application, Android application, whatever we're trying to build for. We have a bunch of platforms that I'll show you, and it basically makes a full screen web view. So we can go and ship our existing JavaScript application, inside of a web view and have it be a native application. And each platform we go and add manually. So platforms, and again, a platform might be iOS, it might be Android, we have BlackBerry and Windows as well. You can also ship for Windows Desktop, but in those cases, I'd probably encourage you to use Electron instead. And each platform is responsible for basically creating a web view within its own shell. Because obviously in iOS, we're choosing between a UI web view and a WK web view, which I'll cover a bit as well. And in Android, we have a completely different web view. It's then responsible for including Cordova.js, which is that core API that we're going to be using all over the place, and just defining those window functions as we need. So we also have an ecosystem of plugins, very similar to platforms. We generally define a window.foo function, window.cordova.camera or window.cordova.contacts or something like that. And if you're looking for plugins, just, there's a link there, there's a plugin registry that you can search. With plugins, what I usually encourage is only use the 10 or 12 that are listed on the official Cordova website. They're generally good, they work very well. That's things like push notification, camera, status bar, network, whatever. The minute you're dipping into community plugins, I really hate to say it, but a lot of times you're dealing with somebody who's just copy-pasted from Stack Overflow until it works. So don't really expect much of a guarantee there. This is just what a standard Cordova setup would look like, just before we get into a demo. So most users who use Cordova CLI or Cordova Raw are just using the CLI, right? We install that on our machine through npm. Cordova lib is the core primitives, though. Something like an ember-cordova that I'm going to be demoing you, we actually don't require Cordova installed on your machine. We just bundle the actual APIs within our own library. So Cordova CLI interacts directly with Cordova lib. And all the CLI really does, right, is creates the commands on your machine and validates that you're passing things correctly. We then have our app folder, and then a series of platforms and a series of plugins. Generally speaking, plugins will work for every single platform. It's very easy to figure out whether they will or not. So just because I promised to say how hybrid works before we got into a demo, so when we're doing a Cordova build, if you're just curious about what's happening internally, that was my alarm for this morning. My iPad is still in Toronto time zone, so it's 8:30 right now. So I was wondering why it didn't go off. So Cordova build basically goes and runs internal tasks for us first, like prepare and validate, right? Make sure our platform isn't malformed, make sure we have all the files that we need. Then goes into our platforms folder that's inside Cordova. It goes and looks for platform iOS Cordova API.js. Why that's capitalized, I couldn't tell you. And then it goes and triggers a platform-specific build, right? So we'll go and build an iOS container for you. We'll go and build an Android container for you. I'm going to show you all this as well. So in the old days, what we used to have to do is go and write these ridiculous make files. This was before something like an ember-cordova existed, which would go and make our Ember project for us, which is what you're seeing right here. Ember's evolved since I wrote this make file, so you don't need to go and completely nuke all of your CSS every time you do a build. And then we go and make iOS as well. And then we kind of popped out with ember-cordova. So what ember-cordova is it's a library for taking your Ember application, doing a build of that Ember application, the same thing that we'd upload to web, copying that over to our Cordova application, and then triggering a Cordova build as well. So a little bit of magic included as well, just to make sure you're not going to completely balk yourself, making sure our Ember parameters are as we need. It also has support for liveReload, which I'm going to show you. We pre-generate your icon and splash screens. If you've ever dealt with that inside Cordova, it can be a challenge, especially on Android. If you're actually a pixel off with your sizing, the entire Cordova application can crash. So we actually generate all of these for you, and a growing ecosystem of plugins. The reason I put this here is we're actually taking a lot of the core Cordova plugins and just making them work better in an Ember context, which means that we're working with promises, not callbacks, and are able to be injected as services, which I'll show you. So what ember-cordova is not, because we often get asked how we differ to something like an Ionic. We're not a UI library, and we're not pretending to be, we're not trying to be. We make your builds easier, we make the actual container that you're dealing with easier, and then we stop. Within Ember, there's already a lot of really good templating libraries. You have Ember Paper from the material. You have our Flexi, which IO partially sponsored. So you basically pick what you want. We also have no opinions as to what you should be doing, but we're starting to publish a list of best practices in terms of performance. So that's our approach to this problem. So just to take that graph again, basically as an Ember Cordova user, you don't interact with Cordova at all. We shield you from all of that nastiness. You deal with us, you deal with our CLI, and even when you're dealing with plugins, we just interact with the Cordova library directly on your behalf. So last points before we get into a bit of a demo here, we've actually also gone and improved, or not improved, we didn't do that work. We've included somebody else's work in our library to just improve the web views for both platforms. What a lot of hybrid developers don't realize in Cordova is the default for iOS is a UI web view, not the WK web view. WK web view is much more performant and includes a lot of the newer JS APIs that you might be trying to use. So we actually default you instead to the WK web view. And if you want to use the old default because you like having slow and chuggy apps, you can just pass the default web view flag. Likewise for Android, I don't know whether anybody here has heard of Crosswalk. If not, you're doing hybrid, you absolutely should be using Crosswalk for Android. Crosswalk is actually built by Intel. It was originally supposed to kind of compete with Cordova, and then it kind of just became a Cordova plugin. And the distinction here is that in iOS, we're not allowed to ship a custom web view. We just have to pick between what Apple give us. On Android, we're actually allowed to bundle our own web view inside the application. So Crosswalk basically takes the latest and best build of Chromium and ships that inside of your Cordova application for you. So we're dealing with a really old device. You'll actually find a 5 to 10x speed bump because we have a much better JavaScript engine included in our app now. The other real benefit here, though, is a lot of times when you're building for Android, you'll find your CSS rules will be passed completely differently. So we now actually have some consistency, and we can trust that it will be rendered the same on every single device. Now, I didn't put it here, but the downside of Crosswalk, just to be very open with you, is it adds 20 megabytes to your APK size. I don't think that's a big deal. Twitter is over 200 megs. I tried to download Facebook Messenger last night and couldn't do it because I only had 400 megs of Swiss data. So I don't think 20 megs is a big deal. The other thing it does is it actually gives you 2 APKs, one for ARM7 and one for x86. Doesn't really affect you as a developer because you just upload both to the Android store and that will handle provisioning the right APK to the right device on your behalf. Main reason for this is we need slightly different WebView implementations and we don't want to make that 40 megabytes. So before we go to build together, I'm just going to pop open and show you what an Ember application looks like, and we're going to go through some of the build steps. Is that big enough for everybody? Great. So this is a standard Ember app. Everybody in Ember you'll find uses the CLI. If you find an Emberist who doesn't use the CLI, they'd get a lot of strange looks at EmberConf. I think when they asked at EmberConf, it was just under 1,000 people, and there were like 4 people who weren't on the CLI yet. And this is a standard Ember structure in terms of folders. This is pre-generated when you run Ember new, or Ember init, I should say. So we have, let's start with our router. And for the sample app I'm doing, we have a single route called users. And I'm going to show you what that looks like, but this is where we just go and define what's going on inside of our application. Now, the nice thing about Ember is if we need to nest our routes, which I'll undo this in a second, we can actually start doing something like, you should never do a show route, so please don't copy this, but it's just what popped into my head. And the nice thing here is we can actually have several routes active at once. Once I show you the router, the thing here is that we can have multiple layers of context going on. And as we're needing to trigger actions inside of our application, we can walk the tree. We can be several levels below and still find an action that's on our application route, say log in, log out, validate user, or something like that. So I'm just going to undo this so we don't completely break our demo. And to show you what a route looks like, we're going to pretend this doesn't exist. This is just me injecting fake data into an application so I could show you something. But each route has lifecycle hooks. So typically in model, this is where we use Ember data to go and define what it is that we're looking for. So if I wasn't stubbing data, what you'd see is something like return this.store.find user1, for example. And Ember data does this for you. Ember data includes your models, so we can go and define them, which I'll show you. It includes this thing called a store, which we can trigger from anywhere in our application. And then doing store.find user1 will just generate, the correct AJAX request on our behalf and know how to bring that back into application. Likewise, I could trigger a find all, I could query by parameters, or I could go and do a delete. It works exactly as you expect a standard, JSON to RESTful API to work. Setup controller, basically if you've used React or Angular, you're probably used to something like this as well. We just need to hang the response from our models somewhere. This address is just somewhere that we typically will namespace our models under so that when we're dealing with a controller, we understand what data was a model and what was a first-class citizen of the controller that we just wrote. And then obviously here, we go and define actions on a route as well. And again, actions are the things that our Ember application is going to do. They can be defined at any level, and a lot of the art of creating an Ember application is putting your actions in the right spot. So, in a template, and I'll show you what it looks like, we basically go and tell it that, when somebody clicks or does something, I want you to trigger this action that I passed in from wherever. Quickly show you what a model looks like as well. You'll see I'm just going in and saying that each user has a first name, last name, and an email. And I'll tell you what this computed property is in a bit, but this is how Ember data knows how to serialize what we're trying to do. If you're curious as well, has anybody seen syntax like this before? Because I'm not sure if this is just an Ember convention or is broader in JavaScript, but this is what we typically call deconstructing the local namespace. So instead of a developer wondering out of this monstrous Ember API, what are all of the different functions that we were using, I'm making it clear that I'm just using model and attra from DS and computed from Ember. So a developer can look at the top of my file and understand what I'm doing, much like a header file. Then we have these computed functions. So a computed function is something that if first name or last name ever changes, it will go through and just recompute somebody's full name. The nice thing is if you have a computed function in your template, it's actually going to go and automatically update in the template for you as well. Ember 2, there's my second alarm because I wasn't sure if the first one would work. I was pretty jet lagged. So the nice thing about Ember as well is it's one-way bindings by default. So it's actually very efficient to drop computed properties. You don't need to be worried about performance at all. And the last thing I'm going to show you is components here. So typically we'd just name a component with a folder, and then we see we have our component.js and our template HBS. So where we have a route that will go and define data, a component is responsible for an isolated piece of your app. That might be a list, that might be a button or something like that. I'm not pretending this is great, this is just for an animation demo I'm going to run later, but you'll see this is just managing its own internal state, and then we have the actual template. And you'll see that component implemented. If I wanted to drop it, it would just look like that, and that component would be included on the page. As we get into a demo, I'm actually going to include and do that. So that's a crash course in Ember. If that was interesting, go to emberjs.com and learn more. It's actually pretty simple to pick up once you get into it. Hopefully what you're seeing, though, is this is an incredibly structured and organized approach to how we're going to build our applications. And if we stay within this realm, Ember will be very, very performant. So let me just pull up this here, and we're going to go through and do a build together. So within ember-cordova, I'm going to run that, and I'm going to run a build at the same time. And while these happen, I'm going to explain what's going on. So this here, Ember-S, is our development server. You probably have something similar in Angular. I believe React now has a CLI as well. And that just gives us our dev server that we can go in. And look at our app. So I didn't really bother building anything pretty for you. On the first screen, there's a single button called Hello. we press it, and we go to a list of our users who all have the same amazing profile picture. So this is the application that we're going to demo with. So what I did over on this screen here is I ran ember-cdv build, which is part of the ember-cordova namespace. And that's the thing that will build the Ember application for you, handle the asset copying, do the Cordova build, and a little bit of extra magic to make sure everything's bound properly. So we can see this is finished. It hasn't bugged out. So because I'm incredibly lazy, I even wrote a command called ember-cdv open that will pop over in Xcode or Android Studio for you so that you don't even need to like Apple Space or whatever it is that you do. I'm just going to simulate this on an iPad screen so it's big so you can see how the build works to start with. See, that's loaded. We have a hello button, and it's basically rendering as we expect. You'll notice here the click is very slow. I'm going to talk about why that is in a second as well. And obviously, we can't see to the side just because I resized the iPad window, which I probably shouldn't have done. So next, what I want to show you is actually, how we generate icons in Splash and, handle that standardized process as well. So within ember-cordova, what we ask people to do is give us a single SVG. The reason we do an SVG is because we can resize with, completely lossless. And if you have like photos of people in your splash screen, basically you're screwed and we don't support you right now. You have to do it yourself. So to show you what these look like, we ask everybody to put two files in the ember-cordova folder, one called icon.svg and one called splash.svg. So both of these, I just made an incredibly basic image, just so I could show you how this would work. And then what we do is ember-cdv make icons. What this is going to go through is it's going to go through for every platform that we have installed, resize it to the size that Cordova needs, and actually go and inject that into our Cordova config as well. So we're just going to wait for that to run. And I'm going to do splashes as well. And while that's happening, just to show you what Cordova needs to do in the interim and what we're saving you from needing to configure, all of this stuff here is what you'd need to be writing yourself if you didn't use our CLI. And you'd also need to be going and making sure that pixel perfect, you've got your SVG or your PNG at the right size. So now that's done, I'm going to run one more build before we go into liveReload, just to show you what that looks like. And while this is running, if you need to add extra platforms or extra plugins to a Cordova application, typically what you do is, some type of CLI like this, like Cordova platform add Android. The equivalent in ember-cordova is something like ember-cdv platform add Android. And there actually is a difference between these two. Because in Cordova, a lot of people, especially new to the platform, get very confused because it actually doesn't back up anything that you install. It doesn't even persist it in a package JSON or anything like that. And you see people doing some crazy stuff, like actually committing the plugins and platforms directories into that Git repo. And what they don't realize is that Cordova actually predates NPM, so its conventions are just a little bit different. So within Cordova, what you'd actually need to do, Android -- save, and this would tell Cordova that, hey, I want you to put this in config XML, so later when I run a reinstall, it will go and install all the platforms I already had. Ember-cordova by default just assumes that you want things saved because I don't really understand the workflow that we shouldn't add something to the package JSON equivalent. Once you've done that, you just run ember-cdv prepare and it will go and reinstall every plugin and every platform that you had before. It's just a much saner way as you're bringing on new developers to your workflow. So now that build's done. Let's pop this open. You see my wonderful splash screen, and the app's opened. And just to go here, we're going to go home and show you that the icon works as well. So that's just being completely automated for us. That will also work on Android. That will also work on any platform. So next thing I want to show you is liveReload because it's going to save you a lot of time as you're developing. So for us, we just run ember-cdvs, which is just shorthand for ember-cdv server. So what that does is it builds a special container application that will again work on every platform. Then it goes and boots the Ember server for us so we can be live reloading as we build. So I'm going to open this here. Booting, booting, booting. There's my wonderful splash screen again. And you'll see we have our hello button here. So what I'm going to do is go into the corresponding template here. And let's put these next to each other so you can see it. And I'm just going to add we'll save. Waiting. Unfortunately, I use an outbound firewall, so it takes a while to show up. But that's just completely reloaded in our application for us. That will actually also work on your device. It's not limited to a simulator. It doesn't need to be plugged into your MacBook at all. The only restriction is they must be on the same network. So you can probably guess how we're pulling this off. Whoops. That's what I'm looking for. So next thing I want to show you quickly is how we use context in ember-cordova and understand what environment we're running in. So we have this platform service. Credit where it's due. We basically got this idea from Ionic and we made the API as similar as possible to not confuse people. So what this will do is it will tell you whether your app is running, inside of any type of Cordova application, whether it's, iOS, Android, or something like that. And the reason we do this is sometimes we want to do a little bit of customization somewhere. So to show you what that looks like, what we're going to do is go in and quickly drop this into our controller. Actually, let's just put it here so it's faster. So, please don't think that I normally leave a line break like that. But what I'm going to do is just add inject, which is another part of the Ember namespace that we want. And then I'm going to inject that platform service, which is typically what we do in Ember. So I'm just going to call it platform for now. And just from the docs, that's what we call the platform. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back up here again one more time. And we're going to write another computed property. I set a lot of alarms. And we're going to do is iOS. And what we're going to do is we're going to write a computed property based on whether the platform is iOS, which you saw in that API before. Right, so that's what our syntax looks like. And what we're going to do is just return this.get platform.isIOS, which is documented to be a Boolean. So I'm going to go to this same template, and we're going to do something with that piece of data. So what we're going to do is just say if is iOS, because we've defined right here that function. We'll say hello, else what are you doing with your life? So we'll put that in. I closed the simulator, so unfortunately I need to open that again. Waiting for outbound firewall. Actually, because I changed snitch networks, unfortunately I need to reboot this. So basically every time you're, I'm just going to do a manual build here. Every time your network IP changes, obviously the server will fail. Because of the way I have my firewall configured, that's just going to change all the time, basically. Let's pop that open. There also is a terminal command to boot to emulator or to boot to your device as well. Just out of habit, when I'm demoing, I do it through Xcode. Waiting. Okay, we have a bug. So what I'm going to do is go to the pre-built app. And this will be the last thing I show you because I believe we're at time. So you know what? Let me just show it to you here. It'll be way faster. Okay, pulling this open, and we're going to see what our problem is. So this is what an Ember error looks like, if you're ever sure. And defined controller class is not a function. If you're not sure what that means, it's just unfortunately you get used to it the further you go into Ember. So what I'm going to do is just clean this up a little bit. Alrighty, let's just clean everything out that we're not using here. Right, so all I did there was just turn off what I believe is failing for us right now. This is the strangest thing, but you're watching a live debug session now. Okay, I believe we're at time. Do I need to stop or should I fix this? Keep going? Sweet. So what I'm going to do, I'm so sad that I have to do this for you all, but I'm just going to write it longhand to make sure that there are no problems there. Boom. So let's go to our users. Great. Index. So this was the problem. Remember when I stubbed that empty index file? And obviously it's complaining that it's an empty controller file. So because I tried to speed up and do a demo, I broke it for you all. So you'll see it knows that we're not running inside of Android, so it's asking what we're doing with our life. If I go and do that same build here, and of course, IP has changed again. Wonderful. One day I'm going to stop running firewalls all over the place, but I'm kind of paranoid. So obviously the reason that failed is the liveReload build wasn't going to trigger, so I just ran a manual build. Opening, opening, opening. Wonderful splash screen. Holy shit, it doesn't like me today. Oh, let's just kill everything. And what I'm going to do is just reactivate these really fast. So I need to just quickly add adders here again, because otherwise it's going to complain that that's undefined and we're trying to access a property. And we'll do one more build. Now, what I didn't get time to talk about today was a lot of how you handle your DOM performance and things like that. If that's interesting to you, what I'll do is tweet out a link where we've spoken about this before in terms of how to get those fluid animations that you need with your CSS and stuff like that. Okay, so we have our hello. We go in, and that is what we'd expect, but obviously I just removed it from the goddamn template. But you see everything booting. I think I'm at time. If you're interested in seeing more, just come to the AMA session. Thank you.
Well, we still have some minutes if you want to
Oh,
take
really?
a question.
I thought it was at 2:50.
No,
Oh.
we still got like 10 more minutes easily.
Oh, really?
You want to do anything else?
No, I can keep going then. Yeah.
Yeah, keep
I thought we
going.
were over.
Anyone wants to question something or want you hear something? Question? Yeah, here, yeah, no one? Just keep going.
Okay, sweet. So obviously here, if you remember, in our template we said if it's iOS we're going to say hello. It's saying hello as we'd expect. So one of the other things you're probably noticing is as I click that home button, it's actually really delayed. And the reason for that is by default, obviously in Ember, we're using click actions, which you find all over the place, and they have a 300 millisecond delay. So we need to go to touch events, which don't have that delay. Instead of binding them yourselves, what we usually suggest is you use a library called Ember Hammer Time. If you install that, it will actually by default fast click your application. And fast click just means that every click is registered as a touch event and it will fire immediately. The other thing Ember Hammer Time lets you do is go and define something like this. This is very old JavaScript I wrote from one of the first demos we ever did before we were even using ES6 in the libraries. But we can go and define a hammer manager and then just get it to trigger when there's a tap, when there's a press, and we can actually define how long it is that we want somebody to have pressed for, or when there's a pen, right, as we're like swinging our finger across the system, and we don't know whether they're swiping right or swiping left or getting some type of direction. One of the things to be careful of there, though, is ghost clicks. So sometimes what people do is they go and register their own touch events, and they wonder why every button's firing twice. Obviously, if you don't go and manually deactivate the clicks or use a library like Ember Hammer Time, you're going to find that you're firing every click event twice, then wondering why you're race tracking all over the place. So next thing I'm going to show you is how we actually test for Cordova, network stuff, and how we actually figure out what's going on the device. So if you're not familiar, there are a series of events that Cordova can tell us by default. Right? So it will tell us when the device is ready, when there's pause, when we lose network, when our battery's low and stuff like that. Device ready is actually special cased inside of Cordova that if you drop a device ready listener and the device is already ready, it will fire immediately. And the reason for this is we don't want to end up with people not waiting for the Cordova shell to be ready and getting into these weird positions with listeners. So what I'm going to do is go and inject something that will just give us an alert once the device is ready. So in here again, what I'm going to do is let's just inject the Cordova service this time, which you'll find documented on our website. Again, normally we'd deconstruct these namespaces, but actually, you know what, we're just going to shorthand this and do it like this. So in Ember, if your variable is the same as the service name, we don't need the string telling it, what the actual service is called. And what I'm going to do is just write something incredibly filthy here. I'm going to use the init hook that already exists on a controller. If we're using this, always super, otherwise very bad things will happen. And then what I'm going to do is just write a quick binding here. And what I'm going to do is copy this over to index, so it just fires as we boot. We don't need to keep changing routes here. All right, because I turned off liveReload, we're just going to do a rebuild. Make sure I've injected everything as we'd expect. What are we complaining about here? Nothing to complain about there, apart from the fact that we didn't bind out arguments correctly. Holy God, nothing likes me today. You know what? Let's just drop this on a root instead. See, so this is another standard Ember lifecycle hook. This obviously fires before we go and define our model, and I'm just going to copy over our service injections. And I'm going to copy over the same binding as well. So this is what our standard bindings look like. Alright, let's kill that. We're in the right folder. And what we need to do is do a rebuild. So you'll see it's complaining about something here, that we have an unexpected token. And again, because we're doing live coding, I just made the same mistake by letting this stay invalid. So I'm just going to delete this because we're not using it, and do another build. So in your typical dev flow, you would just stay on liveReload for a lot of this stuff. Just unfortunately doesn't work for me right now. So we go in, and you see we have an alert that the device is ready. So we can do this for battery indicators, we can do it for whatever we want, and obviously both are firing now because I've gone and fixed the actual problem that we were having. So if we have time, the next thing that might be worth showing you is actually how we write performant animations in a stack like this. So what I've done is this is where this pre-written bad component comes in. And I've called it bad component because this is the worst way you could possibly write an animation at all, right? What we're doing is we're going through, and basically we have a box, which is just one of the CSS classes, and we're basically just going and moving it down the screen, in an interval here. So what I'm going to do is drop this in the template. And as I said earlier, this is how we do that. And I'm going to do another build while I show you this. So what this is going to do is it's going to set an interval that will just continue moving the box down the screen. The reason I'm assigning this to a variable, which unfortunately a lot of developers don't do, is because later when we want to delete it, we can actually just clear that same interval. This.get, this.set is just Ember syntax, so we can store things inside the container that we're using. Possibly should have turned those off, but it doesn't matter too much now. Of course, we need to trigger this. So because I'm so used to working with liveReload, I keep telling it to build before I've actually saved the Ember changes. All right, so we'll clear these alerts again. We'll go to our screen. I just did the same thing again. And obviously, we need to use the right name for components. Alrighty, let's pop this open. Once this animation's gone, I'm going to switch back to liveReload, and we're just going to progressively make the animation better and better. Right, so this is a little box that we're going to animate, and this is going to jank all over the place. Right, so it's not very pretty. We actually have down here that we're dropping, we're not getting many frames per second out of this thing. Right, we do not want our mobile applications to look like that. So the reason for that is because this is just reflowing all over the place. For those who don't know what reflow is, basically it's when the browser needs to go and just geometrically recompute what am I painting, what's going on where, what are my boundaries and borders. And there are a lot of things that will trigger reflow anytime you delete an element from a page, add an element from a page, or even change an element's class. You basically reflowed most of your DOM over and over and over again. Now, there are some special cases within CSS that won't trigger a reflow. These are why you'll see developers get so excited, say, about your translate functions, for example. It's also why you'll see us say use visibility hidden instead of display none. Because visibility hidden will actually remove an element without triggering a reflow. Display none will actually trigger a reflow every time you do that. The other thing that's important to know about reflow is the deeper your DOM is, the more expensive that becomes. So that's the other reason that you'll see that when there's a screen that we really need, slick animations on or slick drag actions on, that we try and make the DOM as flat as possible. And sometimes that just means we have screens that aren't as, programmer happy as we'd like to see. So what I'm going to do is just pre-open liveReload while we fix this animation really quickly. So if we go into the component here, first thing I'm going to show is just what this looks like when we change it to our hardware accelerated functions. So instead of doing top, steps times 10, which is an absolute animation, and again, the worst possible case, what we're going to do is do transform translate y plus steps times 10, which is the same thing we were doing before, just like that. And what we're going to do as well is give it a duration of the equivalent of how long we're running this loop for. Again, though, this is going to be slightly better, but not great yet. Okay, let's open this again. So now we're back to using liveReload, so we can make changes as we need to. Now what you're going to notice is less jank, but the minute we start going over stuff like this, it's still going to clag out a little bit. Okay, let's see what our problem is. Nothing likes me today, does it? Alrighty, let's just go back to this. I think what's going on is I'm having troubles with the network. While that's going on, I can show it to you here. All right, so we're just waiting for the Ember server to kick in. All right, and now we can figure out what's up. Well, that's pretty obvious. For those who can't hear, my fan is going insane right now. Okay, let's see what's up here. So I'm not seeing anything totally broken, which is the really fun part right now. Alrighty, this does not love me today. I have no idea what's wrong with my setup. Yeah, I think so. Well, let's just kill that for now. And yes, you're completely right. So of course, I've never had problems like this in my life. So we're just going to really cut this down so it's incredibly simple. And it's always the most obvious thing, isn't it? Waiting, waiting, waiting. So because I removed the duration, you're seeing that clag a little bit, but we already have a much smoother animation than we had before. If we go down here, we're actually going at 58, 60 per second. If I was to go and re-add that duration command, what you wouldn't see is this choppy box going all over the place. Now, the last step to making these work really well is using something called an animation frame. If you're not familiar with what an animation frame does, is they basically run, it's like 16.66, just mentally think about every 15 milliseconds. And it was really designed to try and stop developers from using several set intervals to keep repainting an app all over the place. So what an animation frame does is it actually allows your browser to batch all of the different property changes you're trying to make in terms of CSS changes and pushing stuff around. Syntactically, I think I'm over. So what I'm going to do is just quickly show you what that would look like without running it. But what you do is you'd write an animate function, something like this. We'd run our same CSS here. We'd iterate our steps, and then what we do is we'd, window.request animation frame animate. And this is going to continuously recursively call itself once we call it once every 15 milliseconds. The danger to using an animation frame is that if you don't time it, if you blow your budget, which means your animation takes longer than that 15 milliseconds, you're actually going to cause more jank than you had before. But again, if you know what you're doing and you have like 7 animations that you need to run, batch them all into a single animation frame and the browser will just kind of optimize all of that work for you. The other big change to an animation frame is that it actually doesn't run in cases when like the tab's not active or something like that. So you're not killing your users' batteries at the same time. So now I know I'm at time. So I unfortunately don't have any times for questions, but I have to put this up anyway. And I'm doing an AMA later, so if you want to see more, just come and see me then. Thank you very much.
This one for you too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, cheers.